I'm really delighted to be talking to Parag Khanna. Parag is based in Singapore. He's written quite a number of books on global geopolitics, demography. Your last book was called Move, on where people are moving around in the globe. We share a lot of interests in different forms of government around the world. So you have created recently a periodic table of states, and this is an interesting idea. So how is this different from, there have been various attempts to measure stateness and governance and so forth. So what is your approach to this topic?
Well, it's great to be with you, Frank. Thank you for having me on your podcast. So the periodic table of states I felt was necessary. It was an itch that I needed to scratch in a way. And part of it also was, you might even say, a grudge or a gripe against some of the existing modes or indices or rankings that were out there that were increasingly narrow, but not looking at the big picture. And the big picture to me was stability. Is a state stable? How do we measure stability? And it turns out when you look at many of the existing, let's call them products out there, they will get at aspects of stability, and they may even talk about stability, but they don't have a formal measurement of stability. Or if they do, it becomes something that's quite subjective, right? You know, a committee of scholars at a control risk group or Oxford Economics will deem on a score of, by a score of 1 to 10 if a state is stable. But stability is the output, right? It is the objective in a way. It is, I call it, the cardinal virtue in the end, is that all states want to be stable, but what are the components of stability? So I don't have any qualms with people measuring quality of life or public service efficiency or industrial capacity. I applaud all of those things, and I wanted to actually integrate, in a way, this is a aggregation exercise of the various pillars of what makes a state stable. And the one particular thing, though, that motivated me at least 20 years ago was actually sovereign credit ratings, because they hold true global sway. Asset allocation is done to a large degree, many trillions of dollars on a daily basis, according to a country's sovereign credit rating. This is obviously in the news right now because of America's own rating. But irrespective of that, it seemed to me more than 20 years ago, as I was the geopolitical backpacker that I am going around the world, that a lot of countries were fundamentally stable, performing well, growing, modernizing, deserving of capital flows, but being sort of, in a way, being categorized as emerging markets, sub-investment grade, based on extremely narrow criteria. So I don't necessarily fault Moody's or S&P for wanting to focus on the single issue of whether or not a state is going to be able to repay its sovereign debt. That is what they're focused on. But clearly there are spillover effects intellectually, where a lot of people more or less align to these narrow and, I would say, antiquated, incomplete measurements. So stability was the goal, and stability is what the...
Okay, so let's define stability.
Right. So stability ultimately is formally speaking, the capacity of a state to maintain its present condition. Right, and it's related to the idea of resilience, which is the ability to bounce back from a shock to that condition or to that status. To me, stability, though, is fundamentally about the ability to manage your external and your internal challenges simultaneously, or to rank highly across metrics of internal and external capacity. So what we did was to break it up into strength, which is often conflated, you might say, with external capabilities, latent power, for example. So the traditional stuff, and as you know, this goes back to the 60s, how we measure strength. Is it military size, territorial size, population, natural resources, industrial capacity, balance of payments, those kinds of things. So I haven't tampered with those. We've added a few more things, because nowadays we also talk about the influence of a state and the strength of a state as a function also of its innovativeness, for example, right? Everything from number of patents to number of companies formed. You could add in some of the geoeconomic variables, as we also did, like the market capitalization of the stock exchange, which enables access to capital for firms in an economy. So let's say all of that is strength. Stateness, and this gets into obviously the domestic, internal terrain. So everything from quality of public administration or again, various metrics of state capacity, public service delivery and efficiency, but also socioeconomic factors, which as we know matter a lot, social cohesion, median income. And then finally, we brought in some pretty novel things for which data sets weren't even necessarily available over the last, let's say more than 5-6 years ago, like food security, climate resilience. And I think if we would look at this menu of variables, equally weighted for now, you would say, yes, all of these things contribute to a state being stable. And this is a more robust list, whether it is from the input side of metrics that you would measure, or the output side or the action-oriented side of policies one should pursue to achieve greater stability, to enhance one's own stability. So it's a big tent, broad church approach.
So it seems to me that you're actually, with that many variables, measuring something much broader than just stability. I mean, North Korea is incredibly stable, right? It's had the same ruling family in power for the last several decades. Never seems to change as far as anyone can tell. But that's not something that would get a good bond rating because, there's lots of things about the government there that, make it a very, undesirable place for people to live and so forth.
It would rank low in a lot more metrics than its sovereign rating, right? It would rank low across the board, more or less, right? So it exists as a...
I mean, if stability is what you're after...
So as it turns out, just the mere continuity of government, right, is one sub-metric of existing indicators that are out there. Not necessarily the worldwide governance indicators, but you could simply temporally measure whether or not a particular regime has survived. But that would be a small s stability. We're going after big S stability here, which is also, again, to some degree, a measure of how virtuous that stability is, right? How sustainable is that stability? How beneficial is that stability for the society?
How about a consideration like the following, that you say that innovativeness and kind of openness to new ideas is an important factor that you think is a positive good. But isn't that, in a way, at cross purposes with stability? I mean, you think about the impacts of all these new technology. You could say America invented social media, and that's really been destabilizing to its political system. AI, as it comes in, could lead to stability, but I would predict that it's going to have extremely disruptive effects. And so aren't these a little bit at cross purposes?
So it isn't, I think it's a great question. It isn't inherent in the notion of technological productivity or innovation that it becomes politically destabilizing. It can be, which is a scenario and potentially even a likely one, as you're pointing out. On the other hand, some of the metrics that we use around things like AI vibrancy, which is of course here at Stanford, AI vibrancy is not just looking at inventiveness or innovative capacity, but also deployment and whether or not there is some utilitarian dimension to it. So what percentage of the people have broadband internet access? What is it doing to labor productivity and wages? So you would say there are net benefits, of course, to the fair and equitable and widespread deployment of technology. So you can capture those things too and not look. So again, inherently saying that a country ranks high in WIPO's measurement of patents and innovation would not be inherently bad. But if there are downstream negative implications, if you see that there's some inverse correlation between the innovation capacity of a state and its political stability, right, then you might want to subdivide that further, and that's something we can look at.
Okay. So let's talk about one state in particular that I'm concerned with, the United States. I mean, how would you rate its stability over the last, especially since 2016?
Well, so we could have this conversation in terms of our own personal views and lenses. What we're trying to do here, to the extent that one can be objective, and of course I'm putting that in quotes, but we want to let at least this set of metrics do the talking. And one thing to point out is that the United States ranked 6th, right, in our periodic table. Now, to be clear, within the top 20, there isn't a ton of daylight, which is actually an important sign that we're probably doing it correctly, right? No one factor overwhelms others. You wouldn't look at this broad panoply of variables that drive stability and say, simply because the U.S. is going in a direction that is unfamiliar to us and potentially regrettable, that therefore we're going to tamper with the data and make it look like it's some kind of highly unstable regime, right? But based upon the year 2023/24, you can see that the United States already ranks lower, of course, than some of its peers that rank higher in this exercise, like Japan, like Germany, like Korea, that have higher state capacity, that have higher social cohesion, that have lower inequality. And because we're also measuring those things, the U.S., you might say, deservedly doesn't rank in the top 3, 4, 5. That said, the U.S. obviously has enormous strengths that, based upon the indicators as we've designed them, including the traditional metrics of strength, is still obviously quite stable as such. So maybe, as all such processes are, it's a lagging indicator. If the United States continues to erode in terms of rule of law, independence of institutions, freedom of the press, and all of these traditional metrics that are captured by worldwide governance indicators and other sources, then we'll see that over the next 1, 2, 3 years. We'll see America's score go down. But we might see other countries go down as well. These things are all relative. When Germans saw that Germany ranked number 2, this was right before Friedrich Merz's election as chancellor, and people were really worried about Germany being hijacked by the right-wing AfD and other kinds of things. And they said, wow, we ranked number 2, that's amazing. And to some degree, the outcome of that election has validated that Germany manages to retain stability despite these external and internal challenges. On the other hand, it's a sign of how poorly other countries are performing that Germany, for all of its challenges and warts today, is able to rank so high.
So your rankings are all relative, or is there an absolute scale?
It is an absolute scale for sure, but in terms of relative performance, we've only done 1 year, and part of it, and this may frustrate observers, but I do plan to augment and modify the criteria. It's not fixed in stone after just 1 year. So already people have made suggestions about variables to add, variables to drop, new data becomes available. For me, it's not a pursuit of, having a highly visible index that gains media attention. It's actually the pursuit of a good set of metrics for stability that ultimately are actionable. We take this to actual governments and say, look, here is the menu, of all the data out there that you're drowning in all the time. Here are 24 things that we think are going to help you become a better version of yourself. You can pick and choose from this as you like. So when it comes to the United States, if someone were to pay attention in Washington, they might say, where do we rank high? Where could we improve? And that's how countries that are bootstrapping, countries that are modernizing, countries that are taking governance really seriously are looking at data like this. And we've been through this exercise, and we find that, first of all, as you know very well from your own career, the right way to engage with governments, right, is not to say, we impose upon you, these values and these metrics. To say, here are things that might help you become, like as I said before, a better version of yourself. And that diplomatic approach is also really important, to construct it as a menu. And that is where the neutrality, you might say, comes in.
So I don't want to turn this conversation in an excessively wonky direction, but when I first arrived at Stanford in 2010, I started something called the Governance Project that was precisely trying to come up with better measures of, the one thing that I thought was not being adequately measured by things like the worldwide governance indicators from the World Bank was actually what now people would refer to as state capacity. Just the ability, it's not whether the state was democratic or rule-bound, but whether it could actually do the things that it set out to do. And I think there's been more attention paid to state capacity because we've seen some glaring examples of states lacking basic capacity, including the United States. But I'm just curious, how do you actually get to a number on that?
And it's multiple things. So there's subcomponents of the worldwide governance indicators. There's other, as you know, whether it is Bertelsmann or Hertie and other institutions that are trying to measure different aspects of state capacity. All of those matter a lot. And whether it's stateness, a term that goes back to the 60s, or it's current incarnation state capacity, I focus heavily on those things personally, as you do, because I do believe they matter. And you would remember much better than me that Sam Huntington spoke about this many decades decades ago, not the regime type, but the degree of stateness. And I believe that matters in day-to-day life, and it matters for governments that are, again, seeking to improve themselves. And one of the things that, one of the sort of insights from our correlation tables from this exercise was that there's a fair number of states that are improving in their governance capacity in terms of public service delivery, in terms of aggregate welfare, in terms of raising incomes and productivity, quality of infrastructure, these micro variables that you can measure, obviously healthcare and education, and that those are reflections of improved state capacity, and that many of those states, however, are not democratic. And this is obviously a problematic insight for obviously those who promote democracy, because you have a large number of states in the world, perhaps the majority of states in the world, that are relatively small in size, that are quite weak, that are poor. But they're democratic, but they're not yet well governed according to those metrics that you began to measure and that we've brought in. Whereas there's a number of states that we looked at or that emerged, whether it is China, obviously, and Vietnam, or Singapore, much wealthier, or the Gulf countries, the monarchies, Oman and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, or some Central Asian republics like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So you can take 15, 20 countries in the world that are performing very well economically, that are improving those metrics of governance as any one of us would measure it, but they're not fully democratic or democratic at all. So that becomes, I don't want to posit it as a trade-off at all, right? I believe the best states should be able to be well-governed and democratic at the same time. But you do have a set of states that are performing better than many democratic states that are not.
No, I accept that empirical result. I think that this was at the basis of, this is one of the key premises of my political order books, which was that all good things do not necessarily go together. In classic modernization theory, there was this view that economic growth, stability, democracy, rule of law, human happiness were all correlated with one another. And if you wanted
follow
to,
from the other,
and that's what modernization was all about, all of these things happening. And you're right that Huntington was really the first social scientist to say, wait a minute, they're not correlated. That actually, if your expectations grow faster than your capacity to actually meet citizen expectations, then you're going to get instability. And economic growth does not necessarily mean more democracy, and so forth. And so I think that's right. I'm curious about the periodic part of this, of your project.
Right.
So the periodic table means that there are certain electron orbits that if you take them to a higher level, they produce similarities, even though the actual atomic weights of the elements are different. I mean, is there something like that in your...
we didn't take it too far. We didn't stretch the analogy too far in the quantum dimension of the atomic structure, but we wanted to focus actually just on protons and neutrons, let's say, protons being the strength and neutrons being the stateness, because of course neutrons play that role as the atomic glue, as the binding nature. And the aggregate, the sum of those two scores becomes like the atomic mass, which is the stability score. That was the extent of it. There, you can see certain regional groupings or obviously common characteristics show up, but there's obviously a lot of outliers as well when you actually map it onto the periodic table, as we somewhat artistically did. I think in future iterations, it could be a even more complex bottom-up exercise where actually each of the components, or actually each element, you might even say, maps onto a certain state function, and then you score every state in that way. There are many ways to go about it, but so we didn't overkill on the analogy part.
Let's broaden the conversation to another of your specialties, which is geopolitics. It does seem to me that we are going through a very turbulent period right now. A lot of it, I think, is actually driven by the United States because, as far as I can tell, the United States just switched sides in, Ukraine, Russia. Trump seems to have more sympathy for China than he does for Germany or, France. What's your sense about, the at an international level what the stability of the world order is going to be at this moment.
So it's worth bringing it down to first principles of geopolitics, where we're really talking about the distribution of power. And we can come to foreign policy and whether or not those foreign policies derive from this new distribution of power subsequently. But we live in a multipolar world, and we have lived in a multipolar world for a couple of decades. That is, again, something where in geopolitics we're measuring the share of the world economy, the military capacity, the degree of influence that states have, their reserves. We live in a multipolar world. It is increasingly rigidly so, you might even say. And that is reflected not only in the fact that the United States, the European Union, and China represent relatively equal shares of the world economy, but then you also see it manifest in the ways in which they are pursuing truly sovereign, autonomous policies from each other. Despite whatever interconnectedness they may have and interdependence they may have, clearly you are dealing with three distinct independent imperial forms. We'll come back to the empire part also, because I don't think we're really dealing with states, right? It is an inter-imperial relations define the world much more than international relations per se. Then the question is how, and this is the question you asked, well, how does this impact how these actors and players are defining their relations with each other? I think part of the transatlantic rift is the U.S. taking Europe for granted and simply not expecting that Europe would ever live up to the expectations that have been set since the 1990s, which is that with the end of the Cold War, it can emerge from America's shadow, it can further coalesce, it can obviously take on greater responsibility for its own security and so forth. Instead, we've seen that its relative position in the world has declined. It has not been able to manage challenges in its own backyard. And then you have a U.S. administration comes in that says enough is enough. We've been calling for burden sharing across Democratic and Republican administrations for 30-something years, and you haven't done it. We're going to go over your heads and just negotiate with Russia. Trump's own fascination with Putin, notwithstanding, one can, in a secular way, rationalize what the U.S. is, what the Trump administration is trying to do. I'm very interested in the structural dynamic still, which is that irrespective of whether or not the U.S. is able to develop a relationship with Russia that is even the status quo or ante would actually be quite a Cold War, semi-hostile situation. I think it's going to remain that way. So what you have with Russia is effectively like a swing power. And geographically, of course, it's always been challenging to wrestle with a Eurasian power such as Russia uniquely is. One that does not aspire to be European anymore, even if it thinks of itself as culturally European, aspires to have a great deal of influence in Europe, but is also tilting very much towards Asia. So one of the bigger geopolitical question than what happens with Ukraine is actually to what extent the Sino-Russian axis persists as a grand, durable feature of Eurasian geopolitics, because that has a lot to do with the more important empire at the end of the day, which is China. So I'm much more concerned with the structural questions as to how that plays out than what the exact final border settlement in Ukraine is.
Let's look at that question of the distribution of power. In my view, America has gotten a lot weaker over the last decade, and the reason for that is not economic, because now our per capita GDP is actually almost double that of Europe. I mean, it's really pulled ahead, by that measure. China's has slowed down, and so the idea that China is inevitably going to be larger than the U.S., it looks like that may not happen for some time. On the other hand, that power is not usable unless there's a consensus about how you're going to use it. And that's where it seems to me there's been a huge weakening of American global influence and actual power. China, has had economic problems, but it has a pretty unified leadership that has a pretty clear vision of where it wants to go. Is this something you think is, well, first of all, do you agree that there's been this real shift towards China? And if so, how does that play out in the future?
Oh, I absolutely agree, but I would modify your thesis somewhat and take an Asian-centric approach, which is to say that even if the United States did have the consensus or possess the consensus domestically to have a clear vision for itself in geopolitics, Asia would nonetheless have risen as it has risen. And as such, China and its Asian peers and rivals or allies and partners would continue to construct the Asian system that they have been. And I devoted a whole book to this Asian system, and I said that, again, it's not for the United States anymore to dictate what is what are the contours of this Asian system. What we found, for example, with Trump's tariffs, is that it's actually brought rivals in Asia closer together. And it wouldn't be the first time that Japan, China, South Korea, and others have said that in order to cope with an external shock, whether it is a economic shock like the demand shock of the global financial crisis or the Asian financial crisis a decade prior to that, or the rise of Trump and nationalism and protectionism, the solution is that Asian powers must more deeply integrate their economies. And so the response to Trump or any American foreign policy that threatens to destabilize the stability of their relations, again, even if it's in their interest, so to speak, to provide their deterrent capacity and so on, is not something that's going to be viewed positively by even American allies in Asia. That's where we stand right now.
Do you see actual evidence of Japan and Korea, for example, drawing closer to China?
Well, it's only in the sense that they have, and again, this was not the first time. This is every time you have an economic shock to the Asian export-oriented model, is that they simply draw closer to each other and find ways to reduce whatever barriers exist, tariff and non-tariff barriers, to ensure that they can maintain strong export growth. For Japan, which is an economy that is perfectly transparent to understand, some component of whatever minimal growth they have is strongly attributable to commercial exports to China. That's not something that they're going to give up, given their staggering, their very low growth, their structurally low growth situation. The same is true of Korea. And again, we may observe that they're not acting in their own best interest because China is undercutting their lead and their innovative capacity in many areas, from shipbuilding to semiconductors. But they act in that fashion nonetheless. They have the right to define their own interests. I think the structural geopolitical question is, because the United States has neither the capacity nor the will to unilaterally shape the Asian geopolitical system, in what ways can there be a grand strategy not defined strictly as the United States grand strategy, but a global strategy among like-minded states and peers, whether it is the transatlantic partnership of states, so the Euro-Atlantic community where European countries are also trying to develop their own Indo-Pacific strategies, as well as our own Indo-Pacific coalition, which in the Quad countries, for example, Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. Can we have a community of states that has a collective global strategy or a grand strategy towards Eastern Eurasia in particular? I call it the rimland approach to the heartland. Can there be a sort of consent or coalition rimland grand strategy towards the heartland? That's not a dialogue that's formally taken place, but that is something that would be geopolitically consequential, because the United States has limited capacity, willpower, and options in terms of the resources it's willing to commit to maintaining the status quo in Asia.
So it's clear that the United States can't impose a security system or any other kind of system on Asia. I wonder, though, whether the real alternatives are not, when you talk about an Asian system, I mean, one version of that is simply one that is dominated by China. I actually think that this is kind of what the Chinese foresee, that you return to China, the Middle Kingdom being kind of the center of the world, and, Korea, Japan can retain their independence, but they have to clearly defer to Chinese wishes. But it also seems to me that there's some cleavages, even minus the United States, that could run through Asia. Because,
no question. To be clear, I do not believe that the outcome, the hierarchy in the Asian geopolitical order, is going to be a neat and tidy Chinese neo-tributary model of hegemony. I believe that Asia, properly geographically defined as well as stretching all the way to West Asia, is a pluralistic zone. Yes, there is hierarchy where China is obviously more than first among equals, but that doesn't mean that the unique and independent civilizational powers, such as Japan and India and even Russia for that matter, to say nothing of Persia and Indochina and so on, don't have collectively or independently the capacity to offset, to push back against China, which they each clearly do, sometimes with our support, sometimes without. What India is able to do, again, independently and with obviously some defense relationships with Western powers in the Himalayan region, is a good example of pushing back. In the South China Sea, it's most certainly with American assistance, and in the case of Japan in the East China Sea as well. So it's by a combination of means, I believe, that Asia will remain pluralistic, even if it's hierarchical, but it will not truly be the, again, neo-tributary model. I think that Asia, effectively, what I'm saying is Asia is a multipolar region in a multipolar world.
Do you see that multipolarity actually degenerating into something much more conflictual? We just got through a crisis between India and Pakistan in which there were vague hints of nuclear escalation. And I think a lot of people think that that's quite a dangerous situation. I think ever since the invasion of Ukraine, the possibility of military action by China against Taiwan has been on the minds of a lot of people in the region. Seems to me that there could be big discontinuities, because once you actually get into a shooting war, it's much, much harder to predict, long-term trajectories.
Yeah. So the big question will be whether or not these individual flashpoints, of which there are many, and I've written many times, and quite frankly, if we go back to 1992, we know that coming out of the Cold War, people immediately said Taiwan is going to be the origin or the spark for World War III. So here we are 33 years later, and we haven't had World War III yet break out over Taiwan per se, but we have these individual flashpoints, and the question is whether you have chain reactions and domino effects among them, or whether they can be isolated or ring-fenced regionally and locally. That's what we see with India and Pakistan. You could throw in Iran as one Asian flashpoint, Taiwan, obviously, South China Sea, China and Japan as well over the Senkaku Islands. And again, going back 10 plus years, I've been, even though I'm sort of a pro-Asian sort of system, pro-Asian system advocate, right, that they manage their differences within the context of an ever more interdependent system. Again, I concede that all of the major so-called World War III flashpoints are in Asia, every single one of them, right, effectively, except for Ukraine, let's say. But each of them has been managed individually, even Taiwan, even the South China Sea, and so on. So I think that Asians, from a pragmatic diplomatic standpoint, have been able to keep the lid on things. Put more formally, they're able to keep geoeconomic convergence and geopolitical rivalry on different tracks. Whether they can do that forever, I doubt it. I would prefer that they solve the conflicts rather than test their luck. But when it comes to Taiwan, for example, I do think, and we know from the signaling that we see from American allies in Asia, that they're not actually willing to step up and intervene to defend Taiwan. And the more that you see a globalization of TSMC supply chains, the less dependent any one power, including the United States or the global semiconductor industry in general, becomes on Taiwan. And therefore you increase the risk that China is going to be able to coercively or otherwise subdue or subsume Taiwan, and eventually you arrive at, as regrettable as this may be, one country, three systems. And that may be where things are going, because, and one thing, this is very important, and you know this from your interactions as well with the defense community, I certainly have had those conversations as well. You will not find many military officers that actually want to see a Taiwan contingency play out, because they know how it would end, and it would not be a happy outcome for the United States. So to be clear, whatever utterances come from the White House or from members of Congress who travel to Taiwan, and I have total sympathy, and more than sympathy, for the idea that Taiwan should be allowed to pursue, if not full sovereignty, then total political autonomy. It should go without saying that we believe in that self-determination for people. However, getting involved in World War III and losing it, and then losing credibility, losing military assets, and potentially sparking some chain reaction across Asia is not a desirable end state.
Yeah, well, I think under the Trump administration, the likelihood of America taking military action on behalf of Taiwan is pretty disappearingly small. What about China's trajectory? I know that you've got a lot of these external variables will impinge on that, but the China growth model that we were all familiar with seems to me to have been exhausted, 15 years ago, and the new one that Xi Jinping has launched upon seems to me inherently unworkable. I mean, they've doubled down on manufacturing, different kinds of products. Now they're moving into all these high-tech areas, but they're trying to sell into these regions that are already highly destabilized by, the first China shock, and are really not politically, ready to accept yet another generation's worth of, imports from China. So what happens?
There's a lot to unpack there. I mean, so for one thing, as you know, going back to the 1990s, there was a lot of cynicism about China's capacity at all, its political system, to remain stable, to even for the Communist Party to maintain its grip on power in light of the collapse of the Soviet Union and what we projected might be spillover effects and its own internal inadequacy. People feared, and I remember The Economist magazine in particular doing entire cover stories about how China was so fragile internally, based upon high inequality, based upon whether or not the Tibetan and Uyghur populations that were so restive, could remain subjugated, and of course Hong Kong and so on and so forth. But of course China has paid to those predictions at the time. So China has incredible capacity, as you know, and we all concede and appreciate. In terms of the growth model, they're in a far more dynamic process of perpetual reinvention than the misfiring or misguided policies and obviously capital misallocation would suggest. In other words, there's bottom up elements to the top down elements that often aren't appreciated. In terms of their growth model. So whether it is their technology 5-year plans and their ability to capture ever higher rungs of the value chain in sector after sector, and pretty much now reach the epitome of just about every sector that they want to, even now semiconductors, let alone AI and industrial capability. They're already there. Then there's the DeepSeek effect, right, and that the way that's going to sort of reverberate through society and lead to higher productivity.
I mean, they're already there in the sense that they've shown that they can develop these technologies, but for the next great leap in terms of their growth as a very large country, I just don't see where they're going to sell this stuff.
Right. So that's the external question. So that brings us to Belt and Road and dual circulation, right? Which is a classic neo-mercantilism in new clothes, and that's what China has been pursuing for some time. Now, it's very smart neo-mercantilism, both in theory and in practice, self-sufficiency domestically and flooding the world with your excess capacity, as it were, and they've gotten away with that. And Belt and Road, as you've seen over the past decade that it's been around, has actually managed to focus still strongly on global markets. So even Brazil has recently, doubled down on its relations with China, even though they've gone from...
On the other hand, there's about 20 really big projects that are underwater.
Oh, yeah.
And,
so as we know, they're not thinking in terms of pure capital efficiency when it comes to their international projects. They're thinking about it from a strategic standpoint of evading the Malacca trap and having redundant capacity in terms of infrastructural corridors. If you look at the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, then Belt and Road railway corridors became suddenly quite efficient, effective, and important as ways to bypass those bottlenecks. So for them, there's an investment in strategic redundancy, which is crucial when they face those geographical bottlenecks, and that's what one of the original motivations for Belt and Road. But getting back to whether or not all of these emerging markets can absorb Chinese capacity, they're the ones that have the free trade agreements, or the not necessarily free trade agreements, but they have the highest dependency or bilateral dependency of other countries on them for trade. So they do hold the cards in these relationships. They are going to find ways perhaps to divert certain goods or hold on to them and do joint ventures and drip feed these things into the markets. But they do have the upper hand for sure when it comes to their capabilities.
Yeah, that seems to be actually part of the problem. They have the upper hand. They can force concession agreements on these countries that in the long run are not beneficial to the receiving countries. Right. And so they go bankrupt. My particular beef is that they then run to the IMF and say, can you bail us out because we have these really bad loans to China and we can't repay them. Yeah. And I don't really see how that helps either Chinese capacity or influence or prestige?
There's the trade part, which we were just talking about, and the loan part. So the debt trap diplomacy for infrastructure, again, that's sort of exporting their own capital misallocation to other countries, building more ports than you need, or building the wrong ones, or airports, or shiny stadiums that no one uses, and having them even be poor quality. And you find that out when an earthquake strikes, and those kinds of things. And again, that is regrettable. And then those countries going to the IMF then and saying, bail us out. I think the IMF is right to play hardball and say there's going to be a new degree of transparency, conditionality requirements around this if you want us to help you restructure this debt. China then has learned that it then has to forgive and roll over certain loans too. So
all of this is hypothetical at the moment. I don't think a lot of it's happened.
We know that it's country by country, actually. So what happens in Congo versus Ecuador versus Djibouti or Ethiopia or Kenya or Sri Lanka are actually going to play out quite differently, right? That we don't have a one-size-fits-all solution in terms of how Paris Club versus China work together around these countries. There's so much politics involved and idiosyncrasies for each case. Again, it's regrettable that they're in this situation, but a lot of these countries already were heavily indebted poor countries, which makes it particularly challenging for them. I think the deeper question is this capital formation, is this fixed capital investment, whether, certainly in the cases where it's the right projects, is it helping these countries grow such that they can actually pay down their debts? And let's not forget that there are cases like that too, especially landlocked countries in Central Asia, some West Asian countries. Let's be clear, if China is doing electric vehicles, batteries, telecoms, railways, and nuclear power in countries like Turkey, right, or in Egypt and other places. These are actually things that those countries need. What's so interesting right now, and this blends the trade and the investment piece of it, is how, and in Europe, as you know, they're calling this the reverse Deng, right? Do unto China as China did unto the West, right? You now have Western countries saying that, sure, China will trade with you or will import your goods, but you must actually make direct foreign investments in our own capacity. You have to invest in our local firms. You have to transfer technology, employ locals, and all of those things. And that's exactly what the China model has been for the past 40 years. So we're coming full circle in some ways. And the question is, are those countries on the receiving end, whether they're poorer countries or Eastern European countries, are they going to make the most of the Chinese inbound capital flows?
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's such an easy task. It seems to me that we're seeing dependencia theory play out. I think at this point, because of the manufacturing capacity in China already, there's not a single developing country in the world that could replicate what South Korea did. Just move up the value chain and become an industrialized manufacturing country, because who needs another auto company, in the world? Yeah. And so they're stuck, and either they buy the stuff from China in a very subservient position, or they don't develop. But I don't really see a positive outcome there.
So let's take the example of electric vehicles, right? So if you have countries that are drowning in smog and pollution and pay some significant component of their current account deficit is accounted for by oil and gas imports, but they wind up now buying Chinese electric cars and have Chinese power plants electrifying their economies.
There are going to be some benefits to that,
right.
But the cost is that they're actually never going to develop themselves.
They're going to have to much more rapidly move into the services economy and into non-tradable services domestically, as opposed to simply following not just the Chinese, but in general the late 20th century manufacturing export-led growth model. Smart countries have realized that, of course, whatever FDI they can capture, hopefully they'll create jobs out of that, but they have to rapidly transition to services. But that's exactly what we're seeing happening. When you look at where the wages are rising in a place like Indonesia or Thailand or Vietnam and Philippines and so on, it's not obviously coming from manufacturing. In the same way that if we nearshore jobs to America, no one wants to work in those jobs for $10 an hour. So what you're seeing in those economies is the digital dimension and the services economy rapidly growing, and people working in what in Indonesia is the Gojek economy, right? And that's where the higher wages are and so on. So they just have to make that transition more rapidly. In other words, the China shock is part of the premature deindustrialization risk at the same time. And many countries are facing that risk. But what I'm seeing happening is that these countries are actually maintaining relatively low unemployment because the services sector is absorbing those workers. Is that Does that still make them strategically vulnerable to China because of their industrial dependency? Yes, it does. But are they modernizing and growing and even leapfrogging? They're doing that at the same time. So there's no perfect solution, but I think we have to admit that both of these things are happening at the same time.
Okay. Well, I guess I'm still skeptical about how this is going to work out for
No.
a lot of China's partners, but it does seem to me, theoretically at least, that that's a path available to them. So, Parag, what's your next project?
I can never do more than one thing. I'm always doing too many things at any given time, but I'm working on a long essay that I will seek your guidance on either here live or subsequently, called Philosopher Kings. And it's really trying to get at a theory of optimal imperial administration, which is really just a fancy way of saying that if we live in a world of empires, United States, China, and whatever we call the European supranational system, we don't have a good theoretical model for the 21st century world. We look at historical empires and what they did right and wrong in their own context. But in the 21st century, if the United States is, for better or worse, no longer able to sustain being a democratic republic at home and a global empire in a multipolar world, what is the form of government that is going to better allow it to do those things? And all we have in terms of the literature are these trade-offs where we say, well, even though there was this sweet spot, right, where in the Cold War period and the immediate post-Cold War period, the United States was able to be both a democratic republic and an effective empire. But we're seeing that there's trade-offs between the two, where we're not succeeding at either anymore right now. So for the sake of America, if sadly we are not necessarily guaranteed to return to a world of separation of powers and checks and balances and power vested in the people in terms of a democratic order, constitutional order, and if we're flailing as an empire unsuccessfully in many of our foreign policy ventures, what is the optimal type of government for the United States? And I think that's an open question right now, which is why I want to tackle it. But I want to embed it in a broader question about how to run a modern empire and hopefully retain democratic characteristics while being effective in a pluralistic global system. And that's a missing piece. I think it's obviously very important. It's existentially important for the world that we answer that question correctly. So there are lessons potentially that I'm drawing on from China, from Europe, from historical examples as well. But I do want to embed it in an argument that is hopefully realistic and plausible for an American audience today. So that's taking up a huge amount of my time. And then, as always, I'm going to defend globalization. And my next book is yet another take on that, which is called Why Globalism Wins. And I don't have a release date yet.
Okay, well, very good. Well, Parag, thanks very much. This was really fascinating. We'll see how all these different countries move up and down your periodic table.
That's right.
As time goes on. So thanks very much, and good luck with these next projects.
Thank you so much.
Okay.